Morning of July 4th. 1942 arrives over Lucca airfield on the island of Malta with the particular cruelty that summer had made routine. By 7:15 a.m., the air already carries the chemical sting of cordite from the previous night's bombing raid, and pilot officer Raoul Daddo-Langlois stands beside his Spitfire Mark V, squinting across the scorched tarmac towards the harbour. Across the water, the ancient bastions of Valletta are still standing, though barely. Whole streets in the Corkty district have been reduced to rubble. Below the cliff face at Senglea, a rescue team of 12 men picks through limestone debris, looking for 2 families reported missing since 2 a.m. The pilot watches none of this. He is staring at a cardboard box. It is roughly the size of a bread crate, salvaged from the station kitchen stores, and now wedged upright against a blast wall 60 meters from where he stands. His mechanics are watching him with the quiet skepticism of men who have seen too much to be surprised, but not quite enough to stop being curious. Flight Sergeant Raymond Hollis folds his arms and says nothing. Daddo-Langlois has made a bet, 4 cigarettes and a tin of sardines, that he can fire a burst from his Spitfire's Hispano-Suiza 20mm cannons and hit that cardboard box from the air. Not on a strafing run, not at low altitude over an undefended field. He intends to bank the shells off the runway surface itself and ricochet them into the target at an angle that no blast plate or armour panel was designed to withstand. It is, by any practical assessment, impossible. Within 6 hours, that same manoeuvre will have destroyed 4 Axis fighter aircraft over one of the most fiercely contested skies of the entire Second World War. To understand why a single unconventional gunnery trick mattered so profoundly, one must first understand what Malta had become by the summer of 1942. This small island, barely 316 square kilometres of sun-bleached rock sitting 60 miles south of Sicily, had by that point endured more bombing per square kilometre than any territory in recorded history. Between January 1941 and the end of July 1942, the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica conducted more than 3,000 individual air raids on the island. The George Cross, awarded to the entire civilian population by King George VI on April 15, 1942, acknowledged something the dry language of military communiques could never fully convey. The strategic logic was simple and devastating. Malta controlled the central Mediterranean sea lanes. Rommel's Africa Corps, fighting across the western desert towards Egypt, depended on supply convoys crossing from Italian ports at Taranto and Brindisi. Those convoys had to pass within striking distance of Malta-based torpedo bombers and submarines operating out of Marsamxett harbour. As long as Malta held, Rommel bled. As long as Rommel bled, the British Eighth Army retained a fighting chance. The Axis powers understood this completely, which is precisely why they had reduced Maltese civilian food rations to 1,500 calories per day by May 1942, and why the RAF's air defences on the island were outnumbered so catastrophically that at certain points in April 1942, fewer than 6 operational Spitfires stood between a population of 270,000 people and complete Axis air superiority. The island's survival rested not on numerical parity, but on improvisation, discipline, and what the RAF quietly called tactical initiative. Into this grinding, attritional siege, replacement pilots and aircraft arrived by aircraft carrier in small batches. The pilots were often experienced, but they flew machines battered by the Atlantic crossing, maintained with parts cannibalized from wrecked aircraft, and fueled from reserves so thin that sortie lengths were calculated to the nearest minute. Daddo-Langlois had arrived at 249 Squadron in April 1942, with 8 confirmed aerial victories already to his name, earned over the desert skies of North Africa. He was not a novice, but Malta required something beyond conventional skill, and the 4 months he had spent studying the island's specific combat environment had produced an idea that his mechanics, politely and unanimously, considered a waste of good 20mm ammunition. The physics of what Daddo-Langlois had theorized that morning were not entirely without precedent. Ricochet trajectories had been studied in naval gunnery for centuries, and the underlying principle was well understood. A projectile striking a smooth, hard surface at a shallow angle will deflect along a predictable path, losing some velocity but retaining lethal force at close range. What made his application remarkable was the context, using a concrete runway or the flat surface of a harbour as the reflective plane to create an upward deflection arc that could strike targets otherwise shielded by a fighter aircraft's natural blind spot. Every single-engine fighter aircraft of the Second World War shared a structural limitation that had never been satisfactorily resolved. The engine, sitting directly in front of the pilot, created a cone of dead ground directly ahead and slightly below the nose. A pilot approaching head-on from a shallow below-nose angle could not be engaged by that aircraft's forward-facing guns without the defending pilot first breaking away to reacquire. This transition took between 2.5 and 4 seconds, depending on aircraft type and the sharpness of the brake. Daddo-Langlois had spent 4 months looking at precisely that vulnerability. The cardboard box experiment was the final empirical confirmation that his solution was physically viable, that shells could be made to arrive from below the nose of an oncoming fighter at a trajectory no pilot or aircraft designer had anticipated. The mechanics gathered that morning watched him walk back to his Spitfire, climb into the cockpit, and taxi to the far end of Lucca's main runway. Flight Sergeant Hollis retrieved a stopwatch from his top pocket. At 7:43 a.m., the Spitfire accelerated down the tarmac, lifted cleanly into the haze, banked left in a tight circuit at 100 feet, came back at approximately 40 feet of altitude along the runway centerline, and at precisely the moment it passed the blast wall, Daddo-Langlois fired a 2-second burst. The shells struck the runway at an angle of roughly 8 degrees, skipped upward in a tight cluster, and the cardboard box ceased to exist. Hollis looked at his stopwatch. He noted the time in the margin of his maintenance log. 4 cigarettes changed hands without ceremony. The tin of sardines, by unspoken agreement, remained where it was. What occurred that afternoon arrived with no particular announcement. At 2:20 p.m., radar stations at Takali and the Chain Home Low installation near Dingley Cliffs picked up a formation of 22 aircraft approaching from the north-northwest at 18,000 feet. The formation comprised 16 Junkers, Ju-88 medium bombers escorted by 6 Macchi-C, 202 Folgore fighters of the Regia Aeronautica, Italy's most capable fighter aircraft of the period, with a top speed of 372 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 37,000 feet. The raid's primary target was the Grand Harbour dockyard complex at Senglia and the submarine pens at Marsamxett Harbour. 11 Spitfires scrambled from Lucca and Takali within 4 minutes of the radar contact. Daddo-Langlois was amongst the first airborne, climbing hard through the summer haze at full boost, reaching 20,000 feet just as the formation crossed the Maltese coastline near Marsaxlock in the southeast. The standard RAF intercept procedure was to attack the bombers from above and astern, forcing the escorts to turn into the defenders, whilst the lead aircraft broke up the bombing run before the harbour could be reached. It was sound doctrine, and it usually worked. except that by the summer of 1942, the Macchi C-202 had proven itself entirely capable of matching a Spitfire Mark V in a turning engagement below 20,000 feet, and the Italian pilots flying the Malta escort routes were experienced men who had long since stopped making the mistakes that inexperience produces. The first pass by the lead section of 4 Spitfires scattered 2 of the Ju-88s, which immediately turned southwest and jettisoned their bomb loads into the sea between Malta and the island of Filfla. The remaining 14 bombers pressed towards the harbour in a shallow dive from 15,000 feet. The 6 Macchis split into 2 flights of 3, one climbing to engage the diving Spitfires from above, the second turning east to cut off any reinforcing Spitfires still climbing from the direction of Takali. Daddo-Langlois found himself at 12,000 feet, heading roughly north over Valletta, with 2 Macchi C-202s closing from his starboard quarter at high speed. Conventional doctrine prescribed a hard brake left to convert to a turning fight and exploit the Spitfire's marginally superior roll rate at that altitude. He did not brake left. Instead, he pushed the nose sharply down, dived towards the harbour at maximum throttle, pulled level at approximately 1,500 feet above the flat water, and turned back directly into the 2 approaching Macchis at a combined closing speed that was, by his own later estimate in the post-engagement debrief, somewhere above 700 miles per hour. The Italian lead pilot did exactly what any well-trained fighter pilot would do. He held his line, waiting for the deflection shot that would present itself as the Spitfire crossed his nose. What he did not account for was that Daddo-Langlois was not aiming at him directly. He was aiming at the harbour surface itself. At a range of roughly 300 meters, he fired a 2-second burst into the flat water at an angle calculated to deflect upward into the belly and lower engine cowling of the oncoming Macchi. The 20mm shells struck the harbour surface, skipped in a tight pattern, and hit the Italian fighter from below and ahead. The C-202 rolled inverted almost immediately and went straight in off the point of Ricasoli. Its wingman, caught by surprise and committed to a trajectory that carried him directly into the debris field above the impact point, was struck in the engine cowling by deflecting metal and turned immediately for Sicily, trailing thick black smoke. He did not reach it. He put down in the sea 12 miles off Marsac's Lock, approximately 3 minutes later. The rescue boat that retrieved the pilot, Tenente Carlo Moretti, found him conscious but with a fractured right arm and 3 rib fractures from the impact of his landing. If this deep dive into one of the Second World War's most remarkable acts of aerial improvisation is the sort of history that interests you, a subscription to this channel helps bring these stories to a wider audience. The afternoon was not finished. The remaining Ju-88s had reached the harbour and were pulling out of their bombing runs over Senglea when 2 more Macchis, circling at 8,000 feet to provide top cover against exactly this kind of threat, identified Daddo-Langlois as the pilot who had just eliminated their lead element and turned to engage. The 2 Italian pilots came down together from the northwest in a textbook pincer movement, one Macchi attacking from above at 2 o'clock, the second from below at 8 o'clock. The intention was to present their target with 2 simultaneous threat axes, from which no single evasive maneuver could extract him cleanly. Daddo-Langlois chose neither axis. He turned directly into the lower attacker, dived again hard towards the harbour surface, and repeated the ricochet burst at a range of 250 meters, firing into the flat water just ahead of the oncoming fighter. The second Macchi's port wing root disintegrated when the deflected shells struck it from a trajectory no designer had anticipated and no armour plate had been positioned to absorb. The fighter went in near the breakwater at Ricasoli Point, witnesses on the Fort Ricasoli battery wall later reporting a column of white spray and no parachute emerging from the wreckage. The fourth Italian pilot, now entirely alone and watching his complete flight section destroyed in under 7 minutes, broke off the engagement and climbed hard for Sicily at full throttle. He was not pursued. Fuel among the defending Spitfires was, as always, critically short, and no RAF pilot wasted what remained on a retreating enemy, with 17 bombers still needing to be dispersed from the harbour approaches. The final accounting of the 4th of July 1942 engagement made for stark reading at the Regia Aeronautica base at Comiso in southern Sicily that evening. 4 Italian fighter aircraft had been destroyed. 1 pilot was killed. 1 was taken prisoner following his sea landing. 2 escaped. Of the 16 Ju-88s that had crossed the Maltese coastline, 11 had dropped their bombs. Of those 11, 9 had missed their primary targets entirely, their bombing runs disrupted by the chaos of the fighter engagement directly over the harbour at low altitude. The submarine pens at Marsamxett suffered superficial blast damage to 1 retaining wall. The dockyard at Senglea took 1 direct hit, which destroyed a partially repaired destroyer and 3 near misses. Against that modest achievement, the Axis had lost an entire fighter escort flight to a technique that, 36 hours earlier, had existed only in 1 pilot's head, and a bet involving 4 cigarettes and a tin of sardines. Within 48 hours, Wing Commander Jumbo Gracie, the RAF Malta fighter controller, who had been tracking the engagement from the operations room at Valletta, had a typed intelligence report prepared and transmitted both to Fighter Command Headquarters in Britain and to Air Headquarters Middle East in Cairo. The report described the ricochet gunnery technique in precise technical terms, the required surface type, the optimal approach angle, the effective range, and the specific blind spot geometry it exploited. At group captain level, the question being asked was not whether the technique was viable, the engagement had settled that definitively, but whether it could be taught systematically and what environmental conditions it genuinely required to function reliably. The answer to the second question proved more restrictive than the initial enthusiasm had hoped. The technique worked over water or smooth tarmac, because both surfaces provided the consistent reflective geometry needed for predictable deflection. Over open desert or broken terrain or damaged urban surfaces, the surface irregularities made the ricochet trajectory unpredictable to a degree that the risk of an errant burst striking friendly aircraft or ground positions could not be discounted. Over the sea approaches to Malta, however, and over the harbours themselves in calm weather, the conditions were near ideal. The RAF's Malta wing integrated a modified version of the technique into its tactical briefings by July 15, 1942, and at least 3 further confirmed kills during the summer and autumn of 1942 were attributed in after-action reports to deliberate ricochet gunnery. The broader significance was ultimately strategic rather than merely tactical. Malta held. Its survival was not assured by any single engagement or any single pilot's ingenuity, but by the accumulation of exactly these kinds of small, often invisible acts of problem-solving under pressure. Between May and November 1942, the island's combined air and naval defences destroyed or damaged sufficient Axis aircraft and supply shipping to force a fundamental reassessment of the proposed airborne invasion, Operation Hercules, which had been planned for June 1942 and was progressively postponed, revised, and ultimately shelved. Rommel's supply lines, increasingly interdicted by Malta-based operations as the siege finally began to lift through the autumn of 1942, were stretched past the point of reliable recovery by the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October. The connections between them are not simple, but they are genuine. Raoul Daddo-Langlois was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Flying Cross in August 1942. The citation, in the compressed understatement that characterized official RAF commendations, noted his exceptional initiative in developing unorthodox gunnery techniques under operational conditions. He survived the war with 17 confirmed aerial victories and returned to England in early 1943, spending 6 months at the Central Gunnery School at Sutton Bridge in Lincolnshire. There he worked alongside armament specialists to document his ricochet approach in terms precise enough to be included in the Advanced Fighter Tactics curriculum, producing a 12-page classified supplement to the standard gunnery manual that was distributed to operational conversion units by March 1943. How many pilots subsequently used the technique in combat, and with what results, remains incompletely recorded. The nature of air combat does not lend itself to clean attribution. On the morning of July 4th, 1942, Flight Sergeant Hollis watches the cardboard box cease to exist and says nothing for a long moment. He looks at his stopwatch, notes 7:43 a.m. in the margin of his maintenance log, and hands over the 4 cigarettes. That evening, with the Ju-88s gone and 4 matches down and the harbour settling back into its scarred perpetual resilience, Daddo-Langlois finds the tin of sardines where he left it on the blast wall. He opens it with his penknife and sits on the warm limestone in the cooling dusk, watching the light change on the water below the Ricasoli breakwater. The surface beyond the harbour entrance is perfectly flat. It would have made, he remarks to no one in particular, an excellent ricochet surface. He is not wrong.